She had stood in the most famous house in the world and told America what elegance looked like. She had walked through its halls with such quiet authority that entire nations took notice. She had hosted kings and artists and poets in her dining room. She had spoken 5 languages, renovated the White House into a monument of culture and history, and transformed the American presidency into something almost mythological. The world called it Camelot, and she was its queen. Then, on a November afternoon in Dallas, Texas, in the back seat of a slow-moving limousine, everything she had built was taken from her in the space of seconds. And what came next was not grief given in peace. It was not mourning aloud in private. It was not the dignified withdrawal of a widow into the shelter of solitude. What came next was the long, relentless, systematic destruction of the one thing Jacqueline Kennedy had always fought to protect above all else: her privacy. For the remaining 31 years of her life, she would be followed, photographed, scrutinized, condemned, commodified, and consumed by a world that believed it owned her simply because her husband had once been its president. A photographer would make his entire career stalking her through the streets of New York. A nation would turn on her the moment she dared to remarry. A husband would humiliate her publicly and repeatedly. And the press, which had once called her the most admired woman in America, would dismantle her reputation with a breathtaking disregard for the human being underneath the image. This is not just the story of the life of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. This is the story of what the world did to her after it no longer needed her to be perfect. This is the story of the end of Jackie Kennedy's privacy. Jacqueline Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York, into a family that had money and social standing and a particular set of expectations about what a well-bred woman was supposed to be. Her father, John "Blackjack" Bouvier, was charming and reckless and unfaithful, a stockbroker who loved to drink and was never quite reliable enough to be trusted. Her mother, Janet Lee Bouvier, was precise and demanding and deeply concerned with propriety and status. The marriage was unhappy and eventually ended in divorce when Jackie was 12 years old. She grew up between 2 worlds: the glamorous, unstable world of her father, who she adored despite everything, and the cool, disciplined world of her mother, who remarried into serious wealth when Jackie was 12 and expected her daughters to carry themselves accordingly. Between the 2 of them, Jackie learned something essential: how to project elegance and composure regardless of what was happening underneath. She was brilliant. Vassar College, then a year at the Sorbonne in Paris, then George Washington University, where she studied French literature. She spoke French, Italian, and Spanish fluently. She read voraciously. She painted watercolors. She had a dry, observational wit that she deployed sparingly in public, but generously in private. She was not the decorative society girl that people sometimes assumed. She was deeply, seriously intelligent, and she had learned very early to keep that intelligence at least partly concealed, because the world she moved in was not always comfortable with a woman who knew more than it expected. She met John F. Kennedy in 1952 at a dinner party. He was a congressman from Massachusetts, already charming, already ambitious, already complicated. She was 22. He was 34. Their courtship was not the grand romance it was later portrayed as. Kennedy was a confirmed bachelor with a long and well-documented history of infidelity. Jackie knew this, or sensed it, before she said yes. But she also recognized something in him, an energy, a vision, a sense of possibility that drew her. They married on September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island, in a ceremony attended by 800 guests and covered by every major newspaper in the country. She was 24 years old. He was 35. The marriage was a complicated thing from the beginning. Kennedy's affairs did not stop with the wedding ring. Jackie endured this with a composure that looked from the outside like serenity and was, from the inside, something much harder won. She built a marriage around shared purpose and deep intellectual partnership, even as the personal intimacy remained fractured. She also built a family that began, as so many things in her life did, with loss. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage in 1955. Her second, in 1956, produced a stillborn daughter, Arabella, a name Jackie gave the child in private, though it never appeared in official records. The grief from that loss was not small. Then came Caroline, born November 27, 1957, healthy and strong, bringing light back into a house that had been shadowed. And then John Jr., born November 25, 1960, 2 days before Caroline's third birthday. On January 20, 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. Jacqueline Kennedy, at just 31 years old, became the third youngest First Lady in American history. She stood in the Washington cold, in a beige wool coat and a pillbox hat, and looked every inch the part of the Queen this new American mythology required. And then she got to work. What Jackie Kennedy accomplished in the White House in the space of roughly 1,000 days was remarkable. She initiated and oversaw a complete restoration of the White House, transforming what had become a somewhat shabby and historically disorganized government office into a museum-quality showcase of American history and art. She created the White House Historical Association to maintain it. She hosted artists, writers, composers, and intellectuals, bringing a cultural energy to the executive mansion that it had not known in generations. She conducted the first-ever televised tour of the White House, watched by some 80 million Americans. She was translated into every major language. Foreign dignitaries who were immune to political charm found themselves enchanted by her. She was 31 years old, managing a household that was also a diplomatic instrument, raising 2 young children in the most surveilled house in the country, maintaining the image of a perfect marriage that was significantly less perfect in private, and doing all of it with apparent effortlessness. The world fell in love with her. It called her an icon. It called her Camelot's queen. It called her the most admired woman in America. And then it watched her husband die in front of her. And it never fully let her go again. November 22, 1963. Jacqueline Kennedy was 34 years old. She was riding in the back of a presidential limousine through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, wearing a pink Chanel suit and matching pillbox hat. She had been smiling and waving at the crowds that lined the streets. The sun was bright. The crowd was enthusiastic. The president was in good spirits. At 12:30 p.m. Central Time, shots rang out. What happened in the next few seconds will never fully leave the human record. The Zapruder film captured it, and its footage, just 26 seconds long, has been watched by millions of people over the decades since. Jacqueline Kennedy saw her husband shot. She was inches away from him. She reached toward him. In the horrible, confused seconds after the first shot, she crawled onto the back of the limousine, whether in shock, reaching for a Secret Service agent, or in some unreachable instinct that has never been fully explained. She was pulled back into the car. She held her husband's head in her lap as the limousine raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital. By every medical account, President Kennedy was likely dead before the car reached the hospital. Jackie walked into Parkland Memorial Hospital with her husband's blood covering her pink suit. She refused to change out of it. She refused to change. When asked by those around her why she wouldn't remove the blood-stained suit, Jackie is reported to have said, "Let them see what they've done." She wanted the world to see the cost of what had happened in that plaza. She wanted no sanitized, cleaned-up version of the event. She would make the world look at the truth of it. She stood in the cabin of Air Force One while Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States, still wearing the pink suit, still stained with her husband's blood, her face emptied of everything except a terrible, controlled stillness. She was 34 years old, and the world was watching her through every available camera lens, and she did not allow herself to collapse. Not yet. The days that followed were a feat of human endurance that history has rarely matched. While her own grief was of a magnitude that people who knew her said they had never witnessed in a human face, Jackie Kennedy organized, planned, and executed a state funeral that became one of the defining national events of the 20th century. She researched Abraham Lincoln's funeral arrangements and used them as a template. She decided on the riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups. She decided on the eternal flame at Arlington Cemetery. She walked in the funeral procession, a 34-year-old widow in black, and she held herself together for a watching world with a composure that was, in its own way, an act of extraordinary courage. But composure is not the same thing as survival. What the public saw in the weeks and months after November 22, 1963, was a dignified widow conducting herself with grace. What the people who were closest to Jackie Kennedy witnessed was something entirely different. Jackie began drinking, not casually or socially, but heavily, searching for the numbness that daylight hours refused to provide. She began taking prescription drugs, sleeping pills and tranquilizers, the same pharmaceutical solution the era handed to women in distress with troubling frequency. She began having nightmares that she described as so vivid and so terrible that she was afraid to sleep. She would wake in the middle of the night screaming, and she began talking about suicide, not obliquely, not as a distant, hypothetical consideration. Jackie Kennedy talked about killing herself with a directness that alarmed the people around her. She reportedly asked her priest, "Do you think God would separate me from my husband if I killed myself? It is so hard to bear." The question was not rhetorical. She was genuinely searching for an answer that might permit her to stop existing in a world where she had been left behind so catastrophically. Her sister, Lee Radziwill, who was among the first to arrive after the assassination, later told biographers that Jackie in those first weeks was barely recognizable. The composure that the public witnessed was real, but it was performance, a performance that Jackie suspended the moment the cameras were gone and the door was closed. She told friends she felt as though she were going insane. She told them that she had watched her husband die, that she had held his skull in her hands in the back of that car, and that the images would not leave her. She described symptoms that today would be immediately recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1963, there was no such diagnosis, no treatment protocol, no language available to name what was happening to her. She was simply a grieving widow who was expected to recover within a socially acceptable time frame and move forward. She was 34 years old, a mother of a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and she had watched the man she was married to murdered in front of her eyes. She was given pills and sympathy and told to be strong. She was strong, remarkably, devastatingly strong. But the cost of that strength was paid in private, in the dark, in rooms where no camera could follow. And then the cameras followed her everywhere. 2 weeks after the assassination, Jackie Kennedy moved out of the White House with her 2 children. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, and his wife, Lady Bird, had been gentle and generous, telling Jackie to take all the time she needed. But Jackie knew what she needed was to leave. The White House was no longer her home. It was a monument to everything she had lost. She moved back to Georgetown, to the house on N Street where she and Jack had lived before the presidency. She thought, perhaps, that she could find some version of normal there, some quiet. She was wrong. Within days of moving in, the house on N Street had become a tourist attraction. Buses drove by hourly. Strangers stood on the pavement outside, photographing the windows, calling her name, hoping for a glimpse of the widow and her children. People pressed their faces against the iron fence. They left flowers, letters, notes. The intentions were almost entirely kind. The effect was suffocating. 5-year-old Caroline could not play in the front garden. 3-year-old John Jr. could not be taken for a walk without drawing a crowd. Jackie could not open a curtain without triggering a click of cameras. The house she had once lived in privately was now something else entirely. She lasted less than a year in Georgetown. In the fall of 1964, she made the decision to move the family to New York City, specifically to a high-floor apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The building was prestigious and discreet and offered the kind of protective anonymity that a proper Manhattan address could sometimes provide. New York gave her more room to breathe than Washington had, but it was not the sanctuary she needed. New York was the city that contained the most aggressive press photographers in the world, and in that world, Jackie Kennedy was the most photographed private citizen alive. Her every departure from her apartment building was documented. Her grocery runs became news events. Her walks in Central Park with Caroline and John were treated as public appearances, whether she intended them to be or not. She began wearing headscarves and large sunglasses as protective camouflage. She developed the ability to move through a crowd with an expression of perfect blankness, giving photographers nothing they could easily sell. She became expert at not being there even when she was standing directly in front of you. But expert concealment is exhausting. The headscarves and the dark glasses and the carefully maintained expression of inaccessibility were not freedom. They were armor, and wearing armor every time you leave your house is its own kind of imprisonment. The world that had loved her so completely when she was First Lady had not transferred that love into respect for her private life after Dallas. The world felt it had a stake in her. She had been their First Lady, their Queen of Camelot, their symbol of grace under the most unbearable pressure. They had cried over her. They had poured national grief through her composed face like water through a vessel. And they were not prepared to let that go simply because she had a right to be a private person. Privacy, in the years after Dallas, was not something America was prepared to give Jacqueline Kennedy. She was too visible, too symbolic, too much of what the country needed to be true about itself to be permitted an ordinary life. In the years following the assassination, the most important relationship in Jackie Kennedy's life was with her brother-in-law, Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy had been devastated by his brother's death in a way that few people understood from the outside. He carried the grief of it like a physical weight, and in the years after Dallas, he and Jackie formed a bond built on shared loss, shared guilt, shared memory, and something that some biographers have described as considerably more than a sibling's comfort. Whether their relationship became a love affair is one of the most disputed questions in Kennedy family history. The author C. David Heyman, in his book Bobby and Jackie, A Love Story, claimed the relationship was romantic and deeply felt. Other historians have dismissed this interpretation as sensationalistic. What is agreed upon by nearly everyone who observed them during this period is that Bobby became the emotional center of Jackie's world in the years between 1963 and 1968. He called her every day. He visited constantly. He took Caroline and John Jr. on outings, skiing trips to Vermont, hikes, horse rides, doing what he could to fill the impossible vacancy left by their father. When Jackie seemed to be sinking into darkness, it was often Bobby who pulled her back. When the grief became too heavy for her to carry alone, Bobby was the one who sat beside her and carried some of it. He was the last Kennedy brother standing, and he was standing with her. She watched him decide to run for president in 1968. She worried for him with an intensity that went beyond ordinary concern. She had watched one Kennedy walk into history and not come back. She had no reason to believe the world was safer now. On June 4, 1968, Bobby Kennedy won the California Democratic presidential primary. It was a pivotal victory, a moment when the path to the nomination seemed clear. He gave his victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles that night before a jubilant crowd. He finished speaking, stepped off the stage, and began moving through the hotel kitchen toward a back exit. There were shots. Bobby Kennedy was struck by multiple bullets in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. He was pronounced dead the following day, June 6, 1968. He was 42 years old. Jackie was in New York when she received the news. Those who were with her that night said she seemed to break in a way they had not seen since Dallas. She had lost her husband to a gunman. Now she had lost the man who had sustained her through that loss to another gunman. She reportedly said after Bobby's death, "If they are killing Kennedys, my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." She was 38 years old. She had attended 2 Kennedy funerals in 5 years. She had watched 2 men she loved die by violence. And she had 2 children she was raising alone. 2 children who bore the most famous last name in America, and she was terrified for them in a way that no degree of Secret Service protection could fully quiet. She made a decision. She was going to take her children and go somewhere where she could, at least in some measure, protect them. She was going to find safety, even if it meant paying a price the public would never forgive her for paying. October 20th, 1968. Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis on the Greek island of Scorpios. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. In America, the headlines were merciless. One German newspaper ran a headline that translated roughly as, "America has lost a saint." The Vatican issued a statement criticizing the marriage of a Catholic widow to a divorced man. A New York priest conducted a special mass in response to the news, which he called a desecration of the Kennedy memory. Letters flooded newspaper offices by the tens of thousands, and the overwhelming majority of them expressed some version of the same feeling: betrayal. Jackie had fallen from her pedestal so completely and so publicly that the crash was heard around the world. People who had worshipped her 5 years earlier as the tragic widow of Camelot now called her Jackie O with a mocking inflection. The queen who had sold her crown for a yacht. They called her a gold digger. They said she had desecrated Jack Kennedy's memory. They said she had sold herself to a man old enough to be her father. What they didn't say, or didn't know, or chose not to consider, was why. Aristotle Onassis was 62 years old to Jackie's 39. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world, a Greek shipping magnate who operated on a scale that even powerful people found staggering. He was not conventionally handsome, not intellectually distinguished, not culturally comparable to the world Jackie had inhabited in her White House years. He was, in many ways, everything JFK had not been. But he could offer things no one else was offering. He could offer her physical safety. His private island of Scorpios, reachable only by boat, could be genuinely secured. His private yacht, the Christina, was a floating fortress of luxury that could be positioned beyond the reach of photographers. His network of security and influence operated at a level where even the most intrusive press would struggle to penetrate. He was not offering her romance in the storybook sense. He was offering her a protected life for herself and her children. And after 5 years of living inside a fishbowl while privately suffering a series of losses and griefs she had never been permitted to process in peace, that protection was worth a great deal. The marriage contract she negotiated with Onassis was, by all accounts, extraordinarily precise. Its detailed terms were leaked to the press almost immediately, and the public dissection of its financial provisions, including annual allowances, provisions for the children, and a settlement in the event of divorce, added another layer of humiliation to the union before it had properly begun. The people who had viewed Jackie as above the mercenary concerns of ordinary women now had documentation that she was, in fact, thinking very practically about her financial security. She was. Because she had to. Because the woman who had been First Lady had emerged from the White House with significantly less financial security than people assumed. The Kennedy family controlled the Kennedy money, not Jackie. She received an annual pension as a former First Lady, but it was not substantial. She had 2 children to raise, a life to maintain, and a security threat she took seriously. She made a practical decision. The world did not forgive her for it. The marriage to Aristotle Onassis did not give Jackie Kennedy the peace she had sought. What it gave her instead was a different and more mundane species of suffering. The suffering of a woman whose husband never pretended to be faithful, and who did not have the luxury of maintaining any useful illusions about what she had married. Onassis had been conducting a long, passionate, and well-documented affair with opera singer Maria Callas for years before he married Jackie. He and Callas had been together since the late 1950s. He had been introduced to Jackie through Peter Lawford and the Kennedy social orbit, and there is evidence that his interest in marrying Jackie was motivated at least partly by a desire to elevate his social standing and acquire a kind of cultural prestige that even his enormous wealth could not simply purchase. Maria Callas was brilliant and celebrated, but she could not give Onassis what the widow of an American president could give him. So he married Jackie. And then he continued seeing Maria Callas. He did not do this quietly. Those who were present in their social world during the marriage have described an Onassis who seemed almost contemptuous of any expectation that he would behave otherwise. Singer Carly Simon, who knew Jackie personally during this period, later recalled that Jackie told her Aristotle would douse himself with cologne before flying to meet Callas, the scent lingering as a kind of deliberate taunt. He publicly referred to Maria Callas as his great love in interviews during his marriage to Jackie. He was photographed with Callas. He made no particular effort to conceal their ongoing relationship. Jackie had been told by those whose counsel she respected to simply ignore it, to accept the affairs as the cost of the arrangement she had entered into. This was apparently the way Onassis had always conducted himself, and no one around him expected that marriage to Jackie Kennedy would change the fundamentals. The marriage that the world had condemned as an act of gold-digging was, in fact, a marriage in which Jackie was being repeatedly publicly humiliated by a man who cared considerably less for her than the public assumed. The woman who the press called Jackie O with contemptuous amusement was privately enduring the same experience that countless women of less fame had endured throughout history, being married to a powerful man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a partner. There was loneliness on that island of Scorpios. There was beauty, extraordinary beauty, the Ionian Sea, and the cypress trees and the whitewashed stone. but there was profound loneliness underneath it. Jackie brought books and kept to herself more than the marriage photographs suggested. She spent time with her children. She kept New York in her orbit as much as possible. She created distance between herself and a marriage that had not delivered what she had hoped. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15, 1975, in Paris from pneumonia. He was 69 years old. He and Jackie had been estranged, and divorce proceedings were reportedly being discussed at the time of his death. Jackie inherited a settlement from his estate, negotiated against fierce opposition from Onassis's daughter Christina, who had always deeply resented Jackie's presence in her father's life. The sum was $26 million, significantly less than the provisions of the original marriage contract had suggested she was entitled to. Christina and Jackie reached a settlement, and then they never spoke again. Jackie Kennedy Onassis was 45 years old, twice widowed, public property for more than a decade, and ready, finally, to try to build something of her own. Before we follow Jackie into the surprising and genuinely fulfilling chapter of her later years, we must spend time with the story that ran parallel to almost everything else in her New York life, the story of Ron Galella. Ron Galella was a freelance photographer who discovered in the mid-1960s that photographs of Jacqueline Kennedy, taken without her knowledge or permission in unguarded moments, were worth substantial sums of money to publications hungry for images of the most famous private woman in the world. He made Jackie Kennedy his professional obsession, not a passing interest, not one of many subjects, his primary, sustained, multi-decade obsession. What Galella did to Jackie Kennedy for years would today be called stalking. By any reasonable definition, it was stalking. He followed her through the streets of New York. He positioned himself outside her apartment building and waited, for hours if necessary, for her to emerge. He jumped out from behind parked cars and trees and other people. He hired boat operators to follow the vessels she was aboard. He disguised himself in wigs and costumes to get closer to her without being recognized. He photographed her children. He photographed her when she was jogging, shopping, walking to school with Caroline and John, attending private events, and simply trying to exist in the city she called home. Jackie said in a court deposition that she lived in what she described as dread fear every time she stepped outside her front door. Not mild discomfort, not irritation, dread fear. The kind of constant anticipatory anxiety that fundamentally alters the quality of daily life. Galella was arrested for harassment in connection with his photography of Jackie and her children. He was acquitted, but the confrontations continued. On one occasion, Galella's sudden appearance startled Jackie while she was jogging and caused a near accident. On another, he positioned himself so close to John Jr., while the boy was riding his bicycle, that the Secret Service agent protecting John Jr. punched Galella to get him away from the child. Galella sued the Secret Service agent for assault. He also filed a lawsuit against Jackie herself, claiming that her Secret Service detail had deprived him of his right to take photographs of a newsworthy person in a public space. Jackie Kennedy countersued. The resulting case, Galella v. Onassis, was decided in Federal District Court in 1972. The judge, Irving Cooper, ruled comprehensively in Jackie's favor, finding Galella guilty of harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault and battery, and invasion of privacy. The judge issued a permanent injunction ordering Galella to stay at least 50 yards from Jackie at all times, 30 yards from her children, and prohibiting him from photographing her from within those distances. Galella violated the injunction almost immediately. When he was caught in violation, Jackie took him back to court. In 1982, a second court proceeding resulted in a new order, reducing the mandatory distance to 25 feet and fining Galella. It also made clear that any further violation could result in criminal charges and imprisonment. Galella continued to photograph Jackie from exactly 25 feet and 1 inch for the remainder of the time she lived in New York. He sold the photographs. He published books of the photographs. He gave interviews about his relationship with Jackie in terms that seemed to describe a shared creative partnership rather than a decade-long nightmare that required 2 court orders to partially contain. He died in 2022 at the age of 91. His obituaries described him as a pioneering paparazzi photographer. Some of them called his photographs of Jackie works of art. Almost none of them asked what it had cost her to produce them. In 1975, 6 months after Aristotle Onassis died, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis did something that surprised the people who had spent 12 years defining her by the men she had been attached to. She went to work. She accepted a position as a consulting editor at Viking Press in New York City. She was 45 years old. She had no professional experience in publishing. She had a great deal of experience reading, a great library in her head built over decades, and a genuine and deep love of books that predated and outlasted every role she had ever been forced to play in public. The publishing world did not quite know what to make of her at first. There were people who assumed the hire was a publicity stunt, that she would show up occasionally, attach her famous name to a few projects, and essentially function as a kind of celebrity mascot. Those people were wrong. Jackie worked. She arrived at the office 5 days a week. She read manuscripts carefully and wrote substantive editorial notes. She cultivated relationships with authors, sometimes calling them directly to discuss their work in conversations that went on for hours. She was not content to have her name on a book without having genuinely shaped it. She had opinions about structure and language and storytelling that were not vague aesthetic preferences, but detailed, specific, informed editorial judgments. When she moved from Viking to Doubleday in 1978, her reputation in the industry was well established. She was not Jackie Kennedy, the widowed First Lady who was now playing at being an editor. She was Jackie Kennedy, a genuinely accomplished book editor who happened also to be a former First Lady. The subjects she was most drawn to at Doubleday were revealing. She pursued books about dance, art, theatre, archaeology, world cultures, and the lives of remarkable people who had been historically overlooked. She worked with artists, choreographers, anthropologists, and historians. She helped bring into print works by Michael Jackson, Jonathan Cott, and Bill Moyers, among many others. She was particularly passionate about books that documented non-Western cultural traditions, understanding in a visceral way how much of the world's heritage was at risk of being lost. Colleagues at Doubleday later described a woman who was genuinely transformed in her professional life. She came to the office with energy. She laughed. She was deeply engaged, curious, and present in a way that suggested this work was giving her something that her previous roles, as senator's wife, as first lady, as public symbol, had not. She had found, in her mid-40s, and after more grief than most people would endure in several lifetimes, something that was hers. Not a role assigned to her by a marriage or a tragedy or a nation's need. Something she had chosen, earned, and built with her own particular intelligence and taste. She was good at it. By every account of those who worked with her, she was genuinely, impressively good at it. In the years following Onassis's death and her settling into the publishing world, Jackie Kennedy Onassis built a private life that was, by the standards of what had come before it, almost ordinary. And ordinary, for her, was a kind of luxury she had earned through 30 years of the extraordinary being imposed on her without her permission. Her children, Caroline and John Jr., grew up and thrived. Caroline graduated from Radcliffe in 1980 and then from Columbia Law School. She became an attorney, an author, and eventually a diplomat. Jackie had protected Caroline's childhood as fiercely as anyone could under the circumstances, and the result was a young woman of formidable accomplishment and quiet dignity, who resembled her mother in more ways than physical appearance. John Jr. grew into one of the most charismatic young men of his generation, and one of the most heavily photographed. Jackie watched this with a complicated mixture of pride and dread. She knew what it meant to be followed by cameras. She had tried to shield him from the worst of it. But John Jr. had his father's magnetism and his mother's beauty, and a last name that made him perpetually newsworthy in a culture obsessed with the Kennedys. In the mid-1970s, Jackie began a relationship with Maurice Tempelsman, a Belgian-born diamond merchant who had known Jackie and Jack during the White House years. He was quiet, cerebral, genuinely devoted, and possessed of none of the grandiosity or infidelity that had characterized her previous long-term relationships. He was still technically married to his wife Lily, from whom he was separated but not divorced for religious reasons. He and Jackie did not marry, but they were together for the last 17 years of her life, and those who knew them described a genuine, warm, companionable partnership built on mutual respect and consistent presence. Maurice Tempelsman walked with Jackie in Central Park. He accompanied her to the theatre and to gallery openings. He was there when the difficult phone calls came. He was there when the difficult news came. He was, at last, simply there, without drama, without betrayal, without the public theatre that had defined every previous relationship she'd had. She jogged in Central Park every morning. She wore the headscarves and the dark glasses that had become her urban camouflage. But the photographs from these years sometimes catch her in unguarded moments, laughing, relaxed, genuinely at ease in a way that the earlier photographs, the ones Ron Galella spent his career hunting, rarely managed to show. She was not unhappy. She was not the perpetual tragic figure the world sometimes preferred to imagine. She was a woman in her late 50s and early 60s who had survived almost everything, who had found work she loved and a companion she trusted and children she was proud of, and who was living as fully as the continued intrusions of public attention permitted. She was not free. She was never fully free. But she had found, within the constraints of her extraordinary existence, a version of peace. And then, in 1993, the world took that too. In the autumn of 1993, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis fell from her horse while fox hunting in Middleburg, Virginia. She was 63 years old. She had ridden horses her whole life, and a fall was not unusual. She was treated for her injuries and returned to New York. But something was different in the weeks that followed. She was fatigued in a way that sleep did not address. She noticed a swelling in her neck. Her doctors, concerned, ordered tests. In January 1994, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. She was 64 years old. At first, the prognosis appeared reasonably hopeful. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was treatable, particularly when caught at a manageable stage. Jackie began chemotherapy. She continued working at Doubleday during her treatment, arriving at the office even on days when the chemotherapy had left her exhausted and nauseous, because work, the act of engaging with manuscripts and ideas and authors, was still something that gave her life shape and meaning. In February 1994, she made the decision to publicly announce her diagnosis. She was not obligated to do this. She could have managed it privately, and given the ferocity with which she had guarded her privacy her entire adult life, a private response would have been entirely in character. But she chose to speak publicly, issuing a brief statement acknowledging the diagnosis and thanking people for their concern. It was a final act of the composure she had practiced for 30 years. A final decision to offer the public what it needed without surrendering more than necessary. The cancer did not respond to treatment the way her doctors had hoped. By March 1994, it had spread to her liver. Once it reached the liver, the situation changed fundamentally. Her doctors told her that the cancer was now terminal. There was no treatment that could reverse what was happening. Jackie Kennedy Onassis decided, with the clarity that had always characterized her decisions under the most extreme pressure, how she was going to spend the time she had left. She was going home. She left the hospital and returned to her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue. She wanted to die in her own home, surrounded by her books, her art, her children, the accumulated objects of a life she had built through enormous effort against enormous resistance. She did not want the clinical white walls and the institutional sounds of a hospital to be her final experience of the world. Caroline and John Jr. came. Maurice Templesman was there. Her closest friends gathered. People she trusted, people who had known her across the years and decades, came to say goodbye without naming it that. She reviewed her will. She arranged her affairs with the precision that had always marked her approach to practical matters. She spent time in the apartment reading and listening to music and looking at her collection of objects, paintings, photographs, and books. She had accumulated around her the physical residue of all the things she had loved. She reportedly took a final walk through Central Park with Maurice, the park where she had jogged for 20 years, the park that Ron Galella had stalked her through with his cameras, the park where she had walked with Caroline and John Jr. when they were small and the world was always watching, was hers that morning, at least as much as it could ever be. On May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died peacefully in her sleep at her apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue. She was 64 years old. The announcement came later that night from her family. She had died surrounded by the people who loved her. She was gone. The world, which had not given her peace in life, gave her something like it in death. The tributes were enormous and largely sincere. The people who had called her a gold digger when she married Onassis found their way to remembering her with something closer to the reverence she deserved. The complexity of her life, the grief she had carried, the privacy she had fought for and never fully won, was honored, at least in the initial days, with a generosity that she had not always received while she was alive. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beside President Kennedy on May 23, 1994. Caroline and John Jr. stood beside the grave, the eternal flame that Jackie herself had designed and insisted upon for JFK's burial site burned near her own resting place. She was home. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was 64 years old when she died, and she had lived more than any reasonable accounting of one human life should contain. She had been First Lady during one of the most transformative periods of American history, and she had shaped that role in ways that every First Lady since has worked within, whether they acknowledged it or not. She had brought genuine culture and intellectual ambition into the White House. She had preserved American history in the form of the White House Restoration, work that continues to this day under the auspices of the White House Historical Association she created. She had shown the world what dignity under pressure looked like, and she had done it at 34 years old while her own private world was collapsing. She had been a mother with fierce, devoted intentionality, raising 2 children who bore the most dangerous name in American public life, and managing to give them something closer to a normal childhood than anyone in their position had any reasonable right to expect. Caroline and John Jr. grew into people of genuine substance and accomplishment. That was not an accident. That was Jackie's work, done quietly and persistently over 20 years, behind the headscarves and the dark glasses and the apartment door that she kept closed against the watching world. She had been an editor of genuine taste and skill, spending 2 decades in a profession that asked nothing of her last name and everything of her mind. She had brought books into the world that would not have existed without her. She had earned her place in that professional world not through celebrity, but through genuine, consistent, excellent work. And she had survived. Against every reasonable expectation, against a series of losses that would have consumed many people entirely, against the relentless, decades-long public intrusion into her most private grief and her most private joy, she had survived with her dignity intact and herself entirely her own. What the world owed her was something it never adequately paid: the right to grieve her husband without performing that grief for cameras, the right to remarry without being condemned for it, the right to walk down a street without a man with a camera leaping from behind a parked car, the right to be a complicated, fully realized human being rather than a symbol frozen in a pink suit on a November afternoon. She asked for these things in court and won only the most limited version of them. She asked for them with every headscarf and dark glasses and closed apartment door for 30 years. She asked for them through her silence in the face of a public that wanted her to be always available, always composed, always representative of something larger than herself. The world gave her fame instead. It gave her mythology. It put her face on murals and posters and magazine covers and postage stamps. It named awards after her and built museums around her memory. What it mostly withheld was the ordinary, unspectacular, irreplaceable gift of being left alone. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis deserved to be left alone. She deserved to walk through Central Park without being photographed. She deserved to grieve her husband and her brother-in-law without the world's cameras in her face. She deserved to make imperfect decisions about her own life without being judged by millions of people who did not know what it was like to be her. She was not simply Camelot's queen or America's widow or Jackie O or any of the other names the world assigned her. She was a woman who had endured more than most people can imagine, and who had, through sheer force of will and intelligence and grace, built something real and sustaining out of the ruins of everything that was taken from her. The myth belongs to history. The woman deserved better. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. There are more stories here, stories of extraordinary lives lived under extraordinary pressure, and we will keep bringing them to you. Thank you for being here.